Welcome to this special budget broadcast. We're in Cape Town on a lovely sunny afternoon, awaiting the Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, to deliver his medium-term budget that will tell us what's going to happen in terms of expenditure over the next 3 years. The mid-term budget comes at a difficult time for the economy. Our economy is expected to grow at a much slower pace than previously anticipated. In February, the expectation was that growth would be around 2.7%. Now, many think, including international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, now many of them think that we're going to grow at around 2% this year. And in the years following, we're going to grow at a slower pace. So anyway, I have with me in our studio Adnan Hardian from KD's Asset Management. He's here to look at what's happening in terms of the budget speech, and after the budget speech, he'll be telling me his views. We'll do a post-analysis on that. Thanks very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Now, like I said, this is a very difficult time for the Finance Minister. What kind of things do we expect him to talk about?
Well, we already know that growth forecasts, at least those published at the time of the budget, has proven too optimistic. And I think the Minister has already hinted at figures closer to 2%, which certainly is the kind of growth figures that we would expect. But we also think that on the inflation front, consumer inflation aside, overall GDP inflation is likely to be a little bit weaker than what was anticipated, so that the combined effect of weaker growth, less of...
No objections, agreed to. The Secretary will read the first and second orders together. The Secretary.
Medium-term budget policy statement and introduction, adjustments appropriation bill.
Now I'm honored and pleased to invite the Honourable the Minister of Finance to the podium.
Honourable Speaker, Mr. President, Mr. Deputy President, fellow Cabinet colleagues and Deputy Ministers, Governor of the Reserve Bank, Ms. Marcus, the MECs for Finance, Honourable Mayors, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Directors General, Honourable Members, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honour today to present the fifth medium-term budget policy statement of President Zuma's administration, the fourth democratic government of the Republic of South Africa. Over the past 4.5 years, this government has steered our country through the worst global recession in 70 years. We have made bold and I believe correct decisions which have restored growth, supported our industries, and maintained a sustainable fiscal policy. This medium-term budget policy statement outlines government's intent to pursue a fiscal path that balances the requirements of counter-cyclicality with a commitment to medium-term consolidation. It keeps government's debt on a sustainable long-term path. It reflects our intent to implement the National Development Plan, to direct public spending to reignite inclusive growth and complement increased private sector investment and skills training, particularly for the unemployed youth amongst us. Create a climate for investment, manage the risks emerging from the current and potential global economic turbulence, cut costs and waste in government, and support black entrepreneurs as investors and partners in our industrialization and broadening of economic participation. Honourable Speaker, we must be frank with our fellow South Africans. This is a tough period, both globally and for the South African economy, but one with many possibilities and opportunities. We are developing and implementing solutions to the challenges facing our economy. The challenge of growth being too slow, unemployment being high, and many households being over-indebted. The challenge of government expenditure substantially exceeding our revenue. Since 2008, we've issued more than 1 trillion rands in debt. Our level of savings is too low to finance the investment we need. We import considerably more than we export. Unless we save and invest more, unless we expand and diversify our economy, unless we accelerate job creation, our aspirations will remain unfulfilled. Above all, we need faster, inclusive, job-creating growth. Without growth, we cannot increase the number of enterprises or create more jobs. Without growth, we cannot generate the revenue needed to fund our social programs, infrastructure investments, and incentives to support important industries. We have a duty to broaden opportunities for those who do not have secure incomes, formal jobs, solid homes, electricity, water, or access to health care. We have to share the benefits of growth so that those of our people who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged can say, "This economy works for me." Faster and more inclusive growth calls for greater cooperation and better alignment between labour, business, government, and other actors to get things done, hearing each other out, finding solutions, encouraging innovation, and building a smart South Africa. Honourable Speaker, it is also appropriate, 19 years into our hard-won democracy, to celebrate our achievements as a young nation. Our economy has grown by over 80% since 1993. National income per capita has increased by 40% in real terms. That's excluding inflation. Total employment has increased by more than 3.5 million jobs. Fixed investment increased from 15% of GDP in 1993 to an average of 20% over the past 5 years. A new tax administration has been established. An overhaul of the tax structure has allowed tax rates to be lowered while improving revenue performance. I would guess that in the last 10 years, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, we've refunded probably 100 billion rands to individual taxpayers in South Africa. Over 600 billion rands in BEE transactions have been recorded since 1995. More than 15 million people are now eligible for social grants. We have built more than 3 million homes and have substantially increased the number of households with access to electricity, water, and sanitation. However, our work is far from done. As President Mandela once said, and I quote, "After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb," end of quote. We must continue our process of transformation against a backdrop of global economic uncertainty, and despite this uncertainty, we must be steadfast, creative, and bold. Honourable Speaker, the central message of the National Development Plan is clear. To accelerate progress, deepen democracy, build a more inclusive society, South Africa must translate political emancipation into economic well-being for all. It is up to South Africans to fix the future, starting today. This medium-term budget policy statement demonstrates government's resolve to implement the NDP through, among other things, the following: expanding electricity, transport and communications capacity, promoting industrial competitiveness and job creation, addressing challenges in mining and community development, supporting growth of our cities and special economic zones, broadening rural development and expanding agricultural opportunities, and strengthening the public service delivery while combating waste and corruption. As the President noted in his budget speech, and I quote, "We have moved to the implementation of the plan. Going forward, all delivery agreements, sector plans, departmental strategic plans, as well as provincial and municipal plans, will be aligned to the National Development Plan," end of quote. So we have a plan, and we now have to track progress year by year in its implementation. Let me highlight some of the projects that we are already having in progress. The construction of the Medupi and Kusile power stations is well underway. Rail capacity has been expanded to support manganese and coal exports. Over the next 12 years, we will replace more than 300 trains for the 2 million people who use metro rail services every day. Tax incentives for industrial development projects, at least now I know you're awake. Tax incentives for industrial development projects amounting to 10 billion rands have been approved over the past 3 years, which will support investment amounting to 35 billion rands. The Manufacturing Competitiveness Enhancement Program has approved 387 applications since mid-2012, with a value of 2.6 billion rands. In support of regional infrastructure development, the Development Bank of Southern Africa has provided almost 1.5 billion rands for road projects in Angola this year and committed funding of 3 billion rands to energy projects in Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo, amongst many other projects. The expanded Public Works Program created 970,000 work opportunities last year. The Jobs Fund has approved allocations of 3.4 billion to more than 60 projects, which will generate 90,000 permanent jobs and about 100,000 training opportunities over the period ahead. The President recently launched the Bridge City project, which brings together public and private investment to create a new urban centre linking the communities of Inanda, Phoenix, and Tuzuma and Kwamashu north of Durban. Another excellent example of partnership between public and private sectors is the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. A total of 47 projects have been approved to be completed between 2014 and 2016. The first 75 megawatt solar plant in the Northern Cape was connected to the Eskom transmission grid last month, 3 months ahead of schedule. 2 wind farms in the Eastern Cape will be connected by May next year. Honourable Speaker, these are just some of the ways in which the implementation of the National Development Plan is proceeding. In many cases, it builds on initiatives that were already underway. In other areas, new programs or reform proposals are being introduced. To support job creation in special economic zones and for young work seekers, a revised employment tax incentive bill will be formally introduced in Parliament tomorrow. This forms part of the multi-pronged approach to expanding work opportunities, especially for young people, envisaged in the National Youth Accord. The evidence on this is very clear. If young people find work within a reasonable time frame after leaving school, this greatly improves their lifetime career prospects. These are steps towards faster, more inclusive growth, and these are all sorry, my prompter isn't working all that well. And these are all areas in which private sector and civil society involvement is no less important than the role played by government. Honourable Speaker, let's look at the economic outlook. In crafting our fiscal strategy for the next 3 years, Cabinet has taken careful account of global and local economic circumstances. Global economic activity remains subdued. In the euro area, which is our main trading partner, GDP growth of 1% is expected next year, after negative growth during much of 2012 and 2013. The IMF has revised down the 2013 growth outlook for developing countries from 5% to 4.5%. Our economic prospects are interconnected with those with these global trends. As the United States tapers its quantitative easing program and starts to raise interest rates, this will impact on our debt costs and might cause further volatility of the rand. For those of us that are not familiar with quantitative easing, this is a process whereby the Reserve Bank of the United States injects $85 billion a month into the financial system. Since about May this year, they've been announcing that they're going to taper. It means cut it down from $85 billion. And this is what has caused a lot of turbulence around the globe. And part of the consequences of this turbulence have reached our shores as well. And so we have emphasized in recent engagements with our international partners that progress towards a better future requires greater global cooperation and greater respect for the interdependence of industrialized and emerging economies. We now expect growth of about 2.1% in the South African economy this year, rising to 3.5% by 2016. Gross fixed capital formation will increase by about 4% this year, mainly driven by public sector infrastructure projects. Private sector investment growth remains subdued, but should gather momentum over the period ahead. Consumer price inflation is expected to average 5.9% in 2013 and to remain within the 3 to 6% target band next year. The Stats South Africa today announced 6% inflation increase over the past period. A trade deficit of 2.6% of GDP was recorded in the first half of 2013, contributing to a deterioration in the current account of the balance of payments to about 6.5% of GDP. Muted economic growth has translated into limited gains in job creation. The quarterly labour force survey indicates an increase in employment of about 275,000 in the year to July, but formal non-agricultural employment growth has been slow. So the challenge that faces us is how do we boost confidence and build stability in this kind of environment? Over the past year, government has been working with business and labour in several sectors to build a better investment climate in South Africa. A recent JSE and UBS roadshow in New York brought government ministers, representatives of the Reserve Bank, and leading South African CEOs together on the same platform, presenting a balanced perspective on the South African economy. Deputy President Motlanthe and Minister Shabangu responded quickly to allay concerns of investors in the mining industry. Ministers Shabangu and Oliphant have also made progress in resolving labour disputes in this sector. Minister Davies has engaged with senior executives and labour representatives to improve cooperation and restore confidence in the automotive sector. Constructive cooperation between government, business and organised labour also characterises the work of the task team on infrastructure, which aims to get these crucial projects moving. Meanwhile, a wide range of measures are in place to give greater impetus to investment. Some of these are the following. Ministers Gigaba and Peters are overseeing substantial improvements in road and rail logistics, including reductions in container handling charges at our ports. The Special Economic Zones framework introduced by Minister Davies provides new opportunities for supporting industrial development and exports. Under Minister Patel's leadership, action has been taken to ensure that competition is not undermined by collusive practices. Improved administration of work permits for skilled foreign workers will be implemented next year by Minister Pandor. Reforms are also underway to enhance private sector participation in the electricity sector and improve the structure of support programs to firms. Work in progress on a new promotion and protection of investment bill and a policy framework to address investor concerns relating to ownership, tax, industrial support measures, and exchange controls is also being done. Government remains committed to macroeconomic stability, supported by prudent fiscal management and sound monetary policy. We are aware of the risks posed by the deficit on our current account, which has so far been mitigated by our flexible exchange rate, but which over the long term requires fundamental change to the structure of our economy. These policies ensure that the country's finances are sustainable, that wages, social benefits and savings are not eroded by high inflation, and that the economy can absorb external shocks. Financial sector reforms are now in the implementation phase, with the Twin Peaks legislation to establish 2 new regulatory authorities to be submitted to the Cabinet shortly. The retirement reform program is also progressing with the consultation process on retirement fund costs at its final stage. Draft regulations will be released shortly. Allow me now, Honourable Speaker, to move to the fiscal policy framework which is set out in this statement. We remain committed to counter-cyclical fiscal management and long-term sustainability. A sustainable expansion of public services is an important developmental goal and cannot be achieved without economic growth. A larger economy means higher revenue. The 2013 MTBPS balances fiscal consolidation with support to the economy. The proposed fiscal framework will meet the 2013-14 deficit target as defined in the new format presented in the 2013 budget review. I must just pause for a moment, colleagues and honourable members, and point out that there is a change in the way in which the deficit is being calculated. So the old number would have been 4.6, the new number is 4.2, but it's accounting, if you like, technicalities that are giving us slightly different numbers, but they mean the same thing. And we've explained this to the media earlier on. We want to narrow the deficit going forward in order to stabilize public debt. Despite all of this, we are growing expenditure at 2.2% in real terms, above inflation, but within a clear expenditure ceiling. We are containing spending growth on wages and goods and services in order to stabilize debt and begin rebuilding fiscal space. Expected gross tax revenue for 2013-14 has been revised down marginally by 3 billion rands to 895 billion. Personal income tax collection remains strong as a result of high wage settlements, and corporate income tax has been robust. Lower revenue growth is expected over the medium term as a result of slower economic growth than we projected in February. The Tax Review Committee, chaired by Judge Davis, established earlier this year, is mandated to inquire into the role of the tax system in promoting inclusive economic growth, employment creation, development, and fiscal sustainability. Its first report on small and medium-sized businesses will be submitted to us before the end of this year. The budget deficit will narrow from 4.2%, remember the old 4.6%, in the current year to 3% in 2016-17. This will stabilize debt over the medium term and begin to rebuild fiscal space. Government's approach is improving provision of public services is therefore focused on better use of existing resources and shifts in the composition of spending rather than raising overall expenditure. In respect of the division of revenue and the medium-term expenditure framework, as members of the House will know, preparation of spending plans for the 2014 budget is now in progress and will be aligned to the NDP. The MTBPS provides a summary of the expenditure framework which Cabinet has approved and within which national and provincial budgets are being prepared. Our Constitution requires an equitable division of revenue between national, provincial and local spheres of government. Over half of all revenue raised by national government through taxes and borrowing is transferred to provinces and municipalities. The MTBPS proposes a national appropriation of 1.1 trillion rands in 14-15, 1.2 trillion rands in 2015-16, and 1.3 trillion rands in 2016-17. Just under 10% of the total, or 110 billion rands next year, will be spent on debt service costs or interest costs. The budget framework includes a contingency reserve, which is 3 billion next year, 6 billion and 18 billion in the following 2 years. This allows for unforeseeable claims on the fiscus and future policy considerations. This leaves 1 trillion rands to be allocated next year, rising to 1.2 trillion in 2016-17. The proposed division of revenue allocates 484 billion rands to provinces, 93 billion rands to local government next year. The provincial share is largely determined by the requirements of education and health services and public service remuneration. Salary costs and infrastructure requirements are the main adjustments to the national votes. New planning requirements were announced in 2013 budget for provincial grant allocations for health and education infrastructure. All provinces have submitted the required asset management plans. Incentives to reward value for money in infrastructure delivery will take effect in the period ahead. In cooperation with the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation, A program of expenditure reviews is in progress, focused on housing, broadband access, industrial development zones, in-service training of teachers, amongst other subjects. The NDP recognizes, honourable members, capable municipalities as the bedrock of a capable state. The National Treasury will continue to closely monitor and engage, and if need be, intervene in those municipalities that fail to live up to the standards of public service established in the Constitution. Minister Sanoli correctly emphasizes the need for more people who can afford to pay for municipal services to do so. We must also appeal to citizens not to damage public property during protests. In supporting municipalities over the MTEF period, a strong focus on economic development is proposed. From next year, the implementation of the City Support Programme will be accelerated, including incentives to encourage more compact and efficient spatial planning and investment. The Regional Bulk Infrastructure Grant receives an additional $934 million over the spending period to finance bulk water projects. By 2014, responsibility for the housing function will be devolved from provincial to local government in 6 metropolitan areas. As a result of these and other additions, allocations to provinces are increased by 11.2 billion rands during the 2014 MTF period, and allocations for local government are increased by just over 1 billion rands. Public expenditure growth has remained well within the limits set by government over the past 2 years. We have again put every effort into finding savings, eliminating waste, and reprioritizing spending towards key social and developmental objectives. Over the MTEF period, 10 billion rands in spending has been reprioritized. To achieve value for money in these initiatives, Honourable Speaker, we need improvements right across government in financial management. This applies equally to provinces and municipalities, where we have to see much better accountability and discipline in the stewardship of public resources. Wasteful expenditure on expensive cars and overseas trips is unacceptable. I will say more on this shortly. Rigorous procurement reforms are being initiated, especially in infrastructure project management, to strengthen service delivery, eliminate waste, and root out corruption. In reviewing the procurement system, we will also ensure that its contribution to broad-based black economic empowerment and local industrial development is reinforced. The NDP recognizes that we need... Now, that was a very meek applause, you know. The NDP recognizes that we need a better education system to address poverty and build a more capable workforce. Education is the largest single category of government expenditure. It is projected to increase by an annual average rate of 7% over the next 3 years to 287 billion rands in 2016-17. The School Infrastructure Backlog Grant and Education Infrastructure Grant will grow strongly over this spending period. Employment and social security is the fastest growing function over the MTEF period, increasing by 14% to 75 billion rands in the outer year. The Community Works Programme will be operational in every municipality by the end of this 3-year period. Under the oversight of the Presidential Infrastructure Coordination Commission, the rate of public investment will gather further momentum next year and beyond, supporting social delivery, industrialization, and skills development. Projects that will get underway soon include a new dam in the Eastern Cape, rehabilitation of the main roadway between Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, and a new coal-fired power station. We are reviewing our financing and regulatory procedures to make them more flexible where needed, to provide for multi-year approvals, and to shorten decision times. These efforts will need to be accompanied by strengthened technical capacity at municipal level in particular. the PICC is focusing on maintenance of infrastructure with proposals to ring-fence budgeted allocations to ensure that we retain the usability and the value of infrastructure over the planned life cycle. The rollout of infrastructure has been accompanied by programs to support the local manufacture of components ranging from buses to energy components. These create sustainable, decent jobs and are part of the legacy that the infrastructure rollout plan will leave. In the past 12 months, we have also seen new projects announced by the private sector in the auto sector, television, film and agro-processing, building on government's investment programs and supported by our development finance institutions. These initiatives signal our shared commitment to invest today for the expansion of the economy and more inclusive growth. Now, on the subject of adjustment appropriation, Honourable Speaker, allow me to comment briefly on the 2012-13 outcome and the revised numbers for 2013-14. Both nationally and in provinces, there has been a commendable moderation in spending growth. I would like to acknowledge the support of Cabinet colleagues and the provincial executives in adhering to budget limits. For the present year, the February budget provided for an appropriation of 1.06 trillion rands. After taking into account the proposed adjustments in the Adjustments Appropriation Bill and the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill, expenditure this year will be 1.05 trillion or 9% more than the 2012-2013 outcome. The budget adjustments this year include, amongst others, 2.3 billion rands for national departments and provinces to cover inflation-related salary increases, 894 million rands rolled over from unspent balances in 2012-13, 500 million rands for expenditure financed by departmental revenue, earmarked amounts for broadband connectivity in schools, troop deployments in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and repair of flood-damaged infrastructure. Details of further adjustments are set out in the adjusted estimates of national expenditure. As government, we acknowledge that we too must provide value for money. Although most government spending is effectively managed, there are many opportunities to cut or minimize costs and to stop abuse. In these difficult times, Cabinet has decided to take a number of initiatives of its own volition, which will apply both to members of Cabinet and to officials in national, provincial and local government departments, and would include state entities and state-owned enterprises. I want to quote the former president of Brazil, a good friend of President Zuma, President Lula, who says, and I quote, "Poor countries must give an example of honesty, of ethics, so that we truly deserve the solidarity from millions and millions of people who would like to contribute, but sometimes are not sure their money will go where it should go," end of quote. In respect of the executive, including provincial and municipal executives, Cabinet, of its own accord, has decided the following. In respect of cars, the cost limits for official cars will be standardized. I don't want to advertise any particular brand. They haven't paid any fees for that. So there will There will be a particular standard that will be applied. For example, a BMW 5 Series or an Audi 6 or whatever the case might be. But that will be the ceiling within which all cars that will be bought for executives at a national and provincial level and in municipal entities will work within. So, Mr. Speaker, if I can get your protection, it's unusual to have all this heckling during an MTBPS. But I understand elections are coming closer, anxiety is getting greater, and then simple etiquette is often...
Order, members, order.
So let me repeat. The Cabinet has decided of its own accord that there will be these following standards that will be put into place for cars. So cost limits will be set. Bulk purchasing will be used to reduce costs, security features will be considered, and there will be no compensation for the use of personal cars. As far as overseas delegations are concerned, business class only for ministers, assistants to ministers will be limited to 2, direct routes will be used, the number of officials to be kept to a minimum by each of the delegations that are going. In respect of housing, ministers awaiting allocation of houses will be accommodated in rented apartments and not hotels any longer. New refurbishment guidelines for limiting costs will be developed. As of now, and as soon as we can get the message out from the presidency, no credit cards will be issued or exist once these notices are received by all executive members around the country. They're to be scrapped. Our approach to reducing costs and eliminating wasteful expenditure in the rest of government will focus on 6 areas over the period ahead, honourable members. The largest is consultancy services. They are, of course, necessary engineering and advisory services employed by government departments. However, we need A, better contract management, B, stricter control of consultancy fees, C, each government entity is to develop a consultancy reduction plan over the course of this financial year. The second aspect is amongst officials as well, no credit cards to be issued and the existing ones to be cancelled. On travel and related costs, the hiring of cars is to be restricted to B class, except for special instances such as rural travel. The number of officials travelling to Cape Town offices will be limited. And the leader of government business, Deputy President Motlanthe, has been asked to engage with Parliament on measures to reduce costs, such as the size of delegations appearing before parliamentary committees and the cost implications of the current Pretoria-Cape Town arrangement, the 2 capitals.
Order, members, order. Allow the minister to continue.
I didn't realize we were having a competition, Honourable Speaker. Business class for overseas travel is restricted to DGs and DDGs only, and locally business class for DGs only. As far as advertising is concerned, guidelines to limit non-essential costs and for better use of GCIS facilities will be developed. Catering and event costs or event management costs, guidelines will be developed for reducing events costs, including better use of government facilities rather than outside venues of meetings. I think this one will particularly interest the members on my left. No public funds to be used for the purchase of alcohol. Entertainment allowance for officials to be restricted to 2,000 rands. And following the review of accommodation leases as office accommodation initiated by Minister Ngesi, steps are underway to reduce long-term office accommodation and government housing costs and make further savings from electricity demand management measures in government buildings. So these are measures that Cabinet has decided upon and which will be implemented both amongst political office bearers and officials employed in government entities or state-owned entities. In conclusion, Honourable Speaker, I want to thank President Zuma for his wise and steadfast leadership and Deputy President Motlanthe for his valued guidance and intervention. I am grateful for the support of the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, members of the Treasury Committee, my Cabinet colleagues and Deputy Ministers, Premiers and Provincial Finance MECs in what has been a difficult but indeed hopeful time as well. My sincere appreciation to the following for their invaluable and constructive contributions: Mr. Taba Mufamadi, Mr. Sogoni, Mr. De Beer, Mr. Chane, who chair the Standing Committees of Finance and Appropriations and the Select Committee on Finance. The Chairperson of SCOPA, Mr. Godi, Parliament itself, honourable members, for the crucial role it plays in processing and overseeing legislation, and we would like to call upon all parties to support government in the implementation of the NDP. Governor of the Reserve Bank, Ms. Marcus, and her team for a very supportive monetary policy. The Auditor General, Mr. Nombembe, who retires shortly, and I would also like to welcome his successor, Mr. Makwetu, and wish him and his staff well for their future work. To the Acting Commissioner of SARS, Mr. Pillay, and the staff of the South African Revenue Service for their creative and valiant efforts to collect revenue and taxes from all of you as well. Deputy Minister Nene for his invaluable support and sharing of duties over the year. To Director General Mr. Fuzile of the Treasury, who provided erudite and prudent leadership, and the vast and dedicated and patriotic Treasury team, which has consistently done what is in the best interest of all South Africans. I also want to add my appreciation to the Directors General of all departments and heads of all government entities, without whose cooperation the work that we do will not be possible. Honourable Speaker, we are living through, as we know, turbulent global economic circumstances. Taking the National Development Plan as a point of departure, Cabinet has agreed to a budget framework which protects our fiscal position and supports policies and programs that support inclusive and sustainable growth. This is a framework that acknowledges that there is hard work ahead and recognizes that a faster-growing economy is in everyone's interests. We will all gain when more people have work. We will all gain when more of our firms can compete in international markets and gain market share. We all gain when rising incomes contribute to greater capacity for public service delivery. We all gain when our divisions and inequality fade into history and we celebrate a shared and more prosperous future. As we head towards 2 full decades of freedom, let us reaffirm our commitment to the ideals that our leaders have stood for. And in the words of former President Nelson Mandela, overcoming poverty is not a task of charity. It is an act of justice. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. Let your greatness blossom. End of quote. Honourable Speaker, I hereby submit the Medium-Term Budget Policy Statement 2013, and I table, amongst the stack of documents, the Adjusted Estimates of National Expenditure, the Adjustments Appropriation Bill 2013, the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill 2013 for consideration by Parliament. I thank you.
I thank the Honourable Minister for his mid-term budget policy statement. Honourable members, the medium-term budget policy statement will be referred to the Standing Committee on Finance and the Standing Committee on Appropriations to consider in accordance with their respective mandates. The revised fiscal framework will be referred to the Standing Committee on Finance for consideration and report. Honourable members, that concludes the business for the day, and the House is adjourned. A very good afternoon to you all.
All right, now we've just been listening to Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan deliver his medium-term budget. After the break, we get some post-budget analysis.
World on DSTV channel 404. Let's take a look at stories making headlines.
Unfortunately, most of the deaths occur in children in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the original focus and the continued focus of this vaccine is on preventing that disease and death.
What happens when you stop by an official who turns out to be, well, the president?
We're checking license.
Okay.
Is it fine and valid?
This stand is the biggest stand in Nairobi show. Of course, we have won the best foreign private exhibitor.
And that was Your World on SABC News, 404 on DSTV.
SABC News plays a critical role in providing unbiased and reliable news. We have a well-established reputation of uncovering, reporting and delivering news. A significant growth in popularity of our news demonstrates the demand for our news content. We continue to provide unrivaled coverage of vital events in and out of the country. Wherever the news is happening, we'll be there to bring them to you at the right time. No one has the news covered like SABC News. We lead and they follow. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome to this special midterm budget presentation. Outside we have Abria Barbia. She's got a political party with her, or representative, with his views on the midterm budget.
Hi, Nompu. Yes, thanks. With me at the moment, I have Steve Swart of the ACDP, who's also a member of Parliament's Finance Committee. Now, Steve, tell me, what is your initial reaction to what you just heard?
Well, the Minister had very little room to move given the global economic uncertainty and our domestic challenges. I think he's done very well under very difficult conditions. He's aligned the medium-term budget with the National Development Plan, which is our strategy broadly supported by all political parties. What is also significant is his intention to cut down government expenditure. And he spent a lot of time emphasizing, let's cut down on credit cards, car rentals, accommodation, cars that people are getting for themselves. So all in all, a lot of positive things coming out of this budget framework under very difficult economic conditions.
Now, you do say that he didn't have much room to move around in, so you basically understand why he went the route that he did. But do you have any criticism?
Well, I think one's got to look very carefully about the National Development Plan and the rollout of the infrastructure plan that is linked to that. That has taken a bit of time, and I would have liked that to have taken place quicker. We're not seeing sufficient jobs being created. That is a great challenge that is facing the government. But what we do see is the deficit is down to 4.2%, which is also welcome and unexpected. So we see that is a positive aspect. Economic growth, 2% is a little low. Understanding again our challenges, we've got to address the strikes, the labour issues in our country. We've got to come together with a social compact for the good of our nation.
Thank you so much, Nompu. There you have it from the ACDP. That was Steve Swart. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks very much, Abra. All right, well, Pravin Gordhan had much to say about cutting costs, cutting government costs. He spoke at length about it. Let's talk to Ardinan Hadian from KD's Asset Management. A surprising set of comments he was making, particularly about slashing costs. Your thoughts?
Well, it was actually rather amusing and, well, encouraging from the perspective that, if the rest of South Africa is going through difficult times, then surely here, there can be some cost cutting as well. In terms of these macro figures, while the GDP figures were adjusted in line with expectations, I was surprised by the extent to which he was able to, at least at the headline levels, not revise his projections to the kind of levels that were anticipated prior to the MTBPS. So the fact that under the revised condition or the revised definitions, they are able to hold the budget deficit at 4.2%, I think is quite encouraging.
Well, it is. I mean, look, I don't want us to get too technical, but it is surprising that they've revised growth down from 2.7% in February to 2.1%, and they're yet able to keep in target in terms of the budget deficit. How do you explain that?
Well, I think on the revenue side, the revenue projections has probably been performing better than what had been anticipated. Certainly, given what's been happening with respect to GDP, there is some longer-term concerns around the ability to continue that. But on the expenditure side, especially given some underperformance on the capex side, they were able to, I think, reduce expenditure sufficient so that, on balance, he could come up with a fairly encouraging deficit figure.
Now, prior to his speech, there was obviously much speculation about what would come out of it. But one of the things that analysts were saying is that it was key that he showed that government was embracing the NDP, the National Development Plan, and clearly they seem to be doing that.
Well, he's certainly done that. It is the kind of commitment that he really needed to reaffirm, given the kind of concerns that has been expressed by both the ratings agencies as well as other major institutions like the IMF more recently.
Okay, I'm just going to interject there. We do have another guest outside, a political party member who's got some comments on the budget. Abra, it's over to you.
Hi, Nompu. Dr. Mulder, Freedom Front Plus, what do you guys have to say about what you just heard?
I think South Africa was spoiled that normally every year the revenue was more than expected, and then you can spend as you like. This year they're predicting getting less revenue. For example, the mining sector normally brought in 22 billion. This year it will only be 12 billion because of the strike. So we're sort of cutting our nose to spoil our faces. So the result is suddenly there's fiscal government discipline. No more accommodation, smart accommodations for ministers, no more credit cards. Surely that should have happened 20 years ago. I don't know why it took them 20 years to get to that. I personally don't use government accommodation. I don't have a credit card, but surely that's the way it should have been done. And I'm worried that it took 20 years, but let's hope it helped to bring the deficit down. The minister is struggling to get the deficit down at the moment. He is succeeding, and that's something special. But I hope he can have more measures to really get that down, because that's the risk for our credit ratings if we don't succeed in that.
And your comments on what he was saying about strikes and how people are responding in protest action?
Yeah. Well, he said there's a lot of actions to stop that, a lot of discussions. But I don't see results in the sense, because really these strikes are killing the economy at the moment. As I said, 22 billion now, only 12 billion coming in. Do people understand that these strikes are so selfish in a sense, looking after themselves and the whole government and economy going down? And at the moment our problems is not necessarily recession anymore. It's a result of this sort of economic selfishness where everybody looks after himself. We can't afford that.
Dr. Peter Mulder of the FF Plus. I also see Mr. Koornoff of the Congress of the People here with me. Sir, good afternoon. Tell me, what are your initial reactions to what the Minister said this afternoon?
Well, I think it was almost too good to be true, but I think he had no choice. He had to reinforce the fiscal framework, and luckily he did that. I think he just did enough to get the credit rating agencies off our back, and whether investors will re-look after South Africa after the speech, we can just hope so. But I think he did enough. A very strong message with regard to the cut of frivolous costs to ministers. It's small if you look at the whole budget, but it is sending a very good signal.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. Nompu, that was Cope. Back to you guys in the studio. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Abra. Thanks very much, dear. Okay, now I also have in studio with me Nazmira Muller. She's from Investec Asset Management. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Do you think Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan has done enough to keep the credit rating agencies at bay?
Hopefully. I think he's done as much as is needed for now. I think the question is how growth develops in the next couple of years, because there are some growth assumptions built in there that are not unreasonable, but some people could view it as a bit ambitious.
Now, he gave lots of examples as to how government is actually going about trying to implement the National Development Plan. But clearly, we're seeing slower growth. We've had business confidence knocked and so on and so forth. Is there something wrong in the way that they're implementing it?
I think there are two issues we need to think about. First of all, the National Development Plan is a long-term plan. So we were never going to see the benefits in the first year. That's the first thing. The second thing, to answer your question more directly, are there problems? I think it's not being coherently implemented because I don't think there's broad-based buy-in at this stage. So yes, I do think there are some concerns around it.
Adnan, is government or the ANC being held to ransom by its alliance partners in terms of being able to effectively implement policy like the National Development Plan?
I thought you were keeping the difficult questions for Ms. Mira.
No.
No, but just on the NDP again, the one point that I think bears repeat is the fact that it has been adopted as policy, but certainly to us as investors, there is still confusion as to the extent of the commitment to that overall policy, especially when it comes to the alliance partners.
Now, Nazmira, you're advising Pravin Gordhan about the current situation and how the government should move on in terms of policy and kick-starting the South African economy. What sort of things would you say to him or advise him?
I think we need to address the long-term or the medium-term blockages that impede growth in the country. And a lot of those have been highlighted by the National Development Plan. So I think the minister is on the right track. I think he's trying to implement the NDP. The issue is he needs to somehow get the rest of his colleagues to buy into that. And that's not an easy task. And then your question about are the alliance partners a hindrance? They have different requirements and different motivations, and they don't necessarily match with the NDP.
But interestingly enough, Adnan, it seems as though, even though there's a lot of controversy with this employment tax initiative, for example, he did reiterate, as his DG, the Treasury DG, said yesterday, that they're going ahead and putting out this bill to ensure that young people try and get jobs so that we can broaden the tax base and so on and so forth. So they're not always listening to their alliance partners, are they?
Well, it's encouraging from the perspective that the minister is reminding all of us that they do recognize that there are serious challenges and some difficult choices that would have to be implemented. That's not always in favor with its key alliance partners.
All right, we're just going to leave it there. We're going to pop over to Abria again. She's got a guest with her. Abria, it's over to you.
I will have with me at the moment Ngaba Yomzi Kwankwa of the UDM. Let's start with positives. What did you find that the minister said was positive?
Actually, if we're to put political point scoring aside for 1 second, one would say most of what was contained in the minister's speech today was positive. Firstly, he was very candid about the problems and the challenges that face the nation and the economy and what we need to do. It was also positive that the government, at long last, has actually decided to sort of not allow itself to be held to ransom by COSATU insofar as the employment tax incentive bill, which will be tabled in Parliament tomorrow. That's a good step. The other good step, obviously, which is long overdue, is their decision to actually cut wasteful expenditure, both at cabinet and government level. That's very important because it sends a strong message out there to the public that we need to start saving money, that we have tough times lying ahead of us. But one challenge is that you find that in government departments there are still wage increases that are above inflation. That's an area that the minister needs to take seriously and look into and try to address. The other issue is obviously the minister tends to be too ambitious when it comes to his focus for budget deficits in years to come. Like, for example, he spoke about 3.2%, and in the past we've never actually achieved any of those targets or forecasts, if you like.
Thank you so much for your time. That was Mr. Kwankwa of the UDM. Studio, it's your turn.
Thanks very much, Abria. All right, well, back to us here in studio. Pravin Gordhan has sort of made the right noises, hopefully, and kept the credit ratings agencies at bay. But what about the Federal Reserve and its possibility of tapering its stimulus program? It's going to have impacts on emerging markets like South Africa, and it seems as though when we have those impacts, we seem to suffer more than our other emerging market partners. When that happens, does the Treasury have any tools in the box to safeguard against the fallout? Nazmira.
The Treasury has woefully little at that exact point in time. We're running a budget deficit which is going to look something like 4.5% of GDP over the next couple of years. It's going in the right direction. That's a good step. But you add to that a current account deficit, which is still above 6%. It's going to hopefully improve next year, but still be quite large. And we are reliant on foreign inflows to fund that combination. So the US Federal Reserve starts tapering, and there is a knock-on effect on the rand. And the only thing the Treasury can do is rein in the budget deficit faster. So it's not an easy solution.
And in fact, one of the areas of weakness in the latest update on the fiscal projections is, I think, on debt servicing costs. To the extent that a process of tapering makes liquidity a little bit more expensive, perhaps that's not adequately reflected in the fiscal figures.
10% of expenditure is now going to be spent on debt servicing costs, isn't it?
Or is being spent.
It is being spent, yeah.
And if interest rates go up, they'll spend more.
All right, we're going to leave it there and pop over to Abra. Abra, it's over to you.
Hi, I just have to interrupt the ANC spokesperson on finance, Mr. Thabo Mufamadi. Thank you for joining us. Sir, your response to what you heard our finance minister say this afternoon?
Well, it was not a total surprise for me, because in actual fact, it is a sign that over the last 19 years, the ANC has been able to drive the economic ship without any failure under very difficult circumstances, global environment. And I think this economic challenges, you have seen more regime changes in Europe than in Africa. He has been, and the government of the ANC has been able to navigate a very tight space, fiscal space, to balance between expenditure on infrastructure and social wage and consolidation of the fiscus, together with ensuring that the budget support growth. Because the minister says, and I think he's correct, and the ANC believes in that without growth, there'll be less employment. Without growth, there'll be less savings. Without growth, there'll be less tax collection in South Africa. And therefore, this budget, in terms of how it has been balanced, it supports growth and it supports fiscal consolidation. More than anything else, I think what we've also done through this budget was to make sure that in the next outer years of the MTF, we do not reduce the capital or the capital expenditure in terms of the ceiling. The ceiling remains the same. It means we'd still have to do more with what was presented in the last budget, in the main budget in February. And I think it is very, very good. As for the cost-cutting measures, they are necessary under the current economic climate. It's not an election ploy, because some people may think that it is a populist stance that ANC is taking. No. Why have we not done it before? Precisely because we've never had the kind of a fiscal squeeze that we have. We've always had, through our counter-cyclical policies, we've had space in terms of fiscal space to have more resources to can do certain things and so on and so forth. But this time around, the fiscal space that we have predetermines that we should actually move in this direction.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. That was Mr. Thabo Mufamadi of the ANC. I'm spying Mr. Tim Harris of the Democratic Alliance right next to me. If I can interrupt his other interview. Tim, your response to what the Minister just said in the House this afternoon?
Obviously, we welcome the very symbolic gestures around ministerial belt tightening. It might be a case of too little, too late. The government departments are spending between 6 and 10% more this year on entertainment and travel than they did last year, but I guess better late than never. The problem is we can't let that mask the fundamental problems in the budget. We only managed to hit our deficit target because we drew down the entire contingency reserve of 4 billion rand. That means we have nothing left in the piggy bank for a rainy day if something goes wrong between now and February. We also needed to rely on 3.5 billion rand underspending by government departments to hit that deficit target. Now that means you're relying on government departments not to spend the money they're given to make sure that we balance the budget. And I think that reflects serious structural problems in our fiscal policy.
The Minister also had quite a bit to say about action taken by protesters and the kind of damage it does. What did you think of that?
Certainly. South Africa has been rocked by problems of investor confidence in the past few months, and he had to say those symbolic things to try and show investors that we can hit our deficit targets and that he's got a plan to tackle some of the problems in labour relations in this country. But what I didn't see, while there was lip service for the National Development Plan, there weren't enough specific NDP proposals codified in the budget. They just simply weren't there. He was paying lip service, but they didn't appear in the numbers, and that's a problem for growth. We're only growing at 2% per year. That's half the rates of Chile, of Turkey, of Malaysia. Other developing markets are doing very well right now. South Africa's lagging, and I don't think this budget answered enough questions on how we can drive growth higher.
Thank you so much for your time. That was Tim Harris of the Democratic Alliance. Back to you guys in the studio.
Thanks, Abra. All right, back to you guys. One of the things Pravin Gordhan talked about, I mean, you can have all the policies in the world that you need, but if you don't have buy-in, as you said earlier, Nazmira, from all the parties that need to have buy-in, then you're not going to move forward. He talked about greater alignment between business, government and labour. This is a conversation that's been had for years. What are your thoughts, Nazmira?
I think there's such huge distrust between those three parties, particularly between business on the one side and Labour on the other. And government, I suppose, is closer to Labour than it is to government, and it's so counterproductive. The most successful economies, like the Scandinavians, tend to work together as a partnership. And lots of people have thrown around this idea of having a CODESA too, and I actually think that's a bad idea. I think a better idea would be to try and develop sort of sector strategies so people are working on more tangible things. The first time I've seen those parties start to work constructively together was in the platinum industry after the tragedy of last year. Beginning of this year, you finally started to see some small attempts to work together to try and resolve the problems. So when people have something tangible to hold on to, I think they're far more likely to try and find a solution.
Adnan, surely we've come to a critical stage in the economy's development where there needs to be buy-in from everyone and people do need to partner.
Absolutely, and certainly if you look at those economies that have managed to do an effective transition, like South Korea and countries like that, one of the things that was incorporated relatively early and effectively was some kind of social compact. You need business, labor and government to actually be able to trust each other. And if you look at the macro projections, one of the areas that has been disappointing of late has been the extent to which the private sector have come on board in terms of investment. And one of the key constraints at the moment, ironically, remains in policy certainty. So in as much as we're talking about the NDP and aligning government policy to the NDP, why is it that business are still feeling that there is lots of policy uncertainty?
Let's hold that thought there. Abra, it's over to you.
I actually have to walk across. I'm trying to get Prince Buthelezi of the IFP. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
That's good, that's good. Prince Buthelezi, what is your party's response to what you heard in the National Assembly this afternoon?
No, I would say that the minister should be congratulated for In fact, none of us could guess how I was going to get out of what is a very difficult situation. Because as far as the economy is concerned, we're in a very bad state, not only here, but throughout the world. But I think that I was very impressed by the fact that they didn't try to sweep under the carpet, for instance, some of the problems that we have. For instance, while the idea is that skills should be given to unemployed youth, but at the same time he told us that less than 1 million jobs have been created for young people. And that, of course, is a big worry because young people are the future. And I would also say that as far as the National Development Plan is concerned, my concern is the fact that in the past, some good plans have been announced by the executive. When I was in government, there was GEA, for instance, by President Mbeki. And the moment the tripartite partners of the ANC made negative noises against it, it was abandoned. So insofar as the minister actually rightly said that across all political parties, we all support, the National Development Plan. But I wonder, with that attitude by one of their biggest tripartite partners, whether it's going to go forward. I was also given some hope myself by the I would call them austere measures that were announced as far as the executive is concerned. The cancelling, of credit cards, which have been abused by some ministers in the past, and standardizing of cars, and abandoning the abuse of use of hotels and so on. I think that at long last people can believe us when we say that we mean business, because in the past, when we say that we were facing one of the biggest, monsters, which is actually poverty, and there was profligacy that took place and corruption, people didn't believe us. But when we see that, then one at least get some hope that maybe at long last we're moving in the right direction.
Prince Buthelezi of the IFP, thank you so much for your time. Well, I think that's it from us in terms of reaction from opposition parties, or all parties. And it seems like overall people are quite positive and happy with what they heard, with, of course, a few criticisms here and there. But Nompu, it's back to you guys in the studio.
Thanks very much, Abra. All right, I just wanted your closing comments before you trundle off. What came out of the medium-term budget that you think will take the economy forward?
Well, I should just, I think, start by saying that although questions remain, especially with respect to the ability to contain the wage bill, what's going to happen to debt servicing costs and so on, the minister should be applauded for actually coming up with quite a good mini budget. I think given the circumstances.
Nazmira, it doesn't have to be positive. Your comments, please.
I think the budget was okay. It wasn't fantastic, but it was okay. I think the issue now is to resolve South Africa's structural issues like youth unemployment. Yeah. And it's about getting those things right. And the minister talking about the youth wage subsidy may well help with that.
All right. Thanks very much to the both of you. That was Nazmira Mullah. She's from Investec Asset Management, and Ardinan Hardian from Acades Asset Management. Let's go for a quick break now, and we'll be back with business response to the budget.
Difficult for you to mention the EFF. You say them, you say those.
Because it's none of my business, so I'm not going to mention them because it's another political party that is contesting space like the ANC.
That's Question Time, Monday to Saturday, Channel 404.
Welcome back to this special broadcast on the medium-term budget. We've had our economists give their response to the mid-term budget, and now I have business representatives joining me. I have Professor Raymond Parsons from BUSA. He's a special policy advisor there. And I also have Asiaf Mohammed. He represents the Black Business Council. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. Asiaf, I'll start with you. How do you feel about the general tone of the budget, and was it business-friendly?
I think it was a very good budget. The Minister clearly set out in terms of where he wants to go. He's got a target of reducing the budget deficit in 2016 to 3%. And it's also from a timing perspective, it's quite good, because what might happen is that the US might start tapering in terms of their quantitative easing, and you might find interest rates going up then. And then the borrowing requirement might then for South Africa taper down if he sticks to reducing the budget deficit to 3%. And he said that out clearly now going forward. Overall, I think it's a very good budget. And also from a business perspective, we believe create some sort of certainty, although a lot more still to be done in terms of infrastructure investments. But the one thing that I would have expected him to do, and wasn't clear about it, and it's a personal pet of mine, is moving away from poverty alleviation to poverty reduction. He's starting with that tomorrow with the Youth Employment Subsidy Scheme, and I think that's a good and a welcome move, long overdue.
The the employment incentive tax or employment tax incentive. Raymond, what do you think about that? Is it a good move?
Well, I think it's supported by business. It's the right thing to do. One must, however, bear in mind that whatever incentives you create, be they perhaps tax incentives or anything else to encourage youth employment, you have to set it against the disincentives. And the National Council of Provinces has just passed the labour legislation today, which I am told by many employers will cause unemployment if it's implemented as it stands. So there's a balancing act, but that doesn't mean to say we mustn't go down this road. And quite clearly, the issue of youth unemployment is an overriding one, and we must take a very challenging and a realistic view of how we can soak it up. It will have to go beyond a tax incentive. There are other steps that would have to be taken. I think as far as the budget as a whole is concerned, business, I think, would have found, as always, the Minister's approach was frank, it was balanced, it was realistic. It was important that he emphasized that whatever is happening in the global economy, we've got to get the answers back home, that the majority of the challenges we face are homegrown, and we must find homegrown solutions. So the commitment to the National Development Plan was strong. I have the impression that the private sector was mentioned more often than in any previous speech, which is not a way of showing off, but rather to say it emphasizes why we need to collaborate, and the issue that was raised earlier of the trust factor between government and business, between business and labour, that's something that has got to be addressed. The trust deficit is one of the biggest obstacles we face in implementing some of the good things that we are committed to. So all in all, I would certainly think that the Minister did not disappoint. But at the end of the day, when his speech is over, the numbers have been pronounced, the rhetoric is there, the plan is there. It comes back to the three words that all South Africans want to hear. And that is, of course, implementation, implementation, implementation. That's the big challenge.
Asif, who's going to make the first move in terms of the collaboration between Labour government and the private sector? Because if that doesn't happen, you're not going to get those three words, are you?
No, there have been a number of moves and initiatives in place, and business and government have been meeting. And as Professor Parsons says, the trust deficit is a key and crucial element. Government has recognised that, and they have been meeting with business. Labour has largely come on board with regard to National Development Plan, except for the concerns that they've raised, but they're broadly in line with it. So I think there's a lot more commonality than, if you might call it, disagreement. Government and business is slowly starting to move forward. We need a lot more to be done. And as Professor Parsons said, and I'm going to repeat it again, it's a question of the NDP and the good ideas and the good plans of implementing and executing it and getting it done. The problem we've had is that it's been a slow execution. The one thing that I do like, and I think we need to give a lot of credit to the Minister on this, is that he's leading by example. He start cutting down on frivolous expenditure like credit card expenditure, cutting and cancelling. I think it's a great move because a lot of people, most likely, that's probably why he's doing it, have been abusing it. So no liquor at government functions. I think it sends a very good message because, as you know, the Minister of Health also wants to ban liquor advertising. Business might not necessarily agree with it, but generally they're starting to set the rules by example, and I think it's a good move. Overall, as I said before, I think what we've set out here is a good medium-term budget, and it's something we can build on.
From an expenditure point of view, the Minister's gesture, probably a dip in the ocean, but a good gesture nonetheless in terms of reining in government spending.
I think in terms of saying to the taxpayer, we know you've got gripes about whether you've been getting value for money, whether what you're paying in your taxes is being well spent. I think today was a good answer that that government is not just talking about being able to really discipline its spending, it's doing some tangible things. It's matching its words with deeds. And I think that's a strong message and an important message that has come through. More broadly, of course, I'm hoping that the credit rating agencies will take note of what he said today. Yes, there's still vulnerabilities in our fiscal picture. What we need is growth. I mean, he has said that. He said it more than once. Because that will make many numbers look better. It'll also make unemployment look better and a whole lot of other good things. But from a fiscal point of view, you also need growth because otherwise you're always going to have your back to the wall from a fiscal point of view, and you're always going to have sleepless nights, about fiscal space and so forth. So I think that was an important message. But it also says to us that we have to have more long-termism in our thinking, whether it's in the public or the private sector. That is why the National Development Plan is so important, because it gives you a vision for 2030. But it says the work has to start now. You've got to take some tough decisions. Some of the decisions were taken today. Some further lie ahead, maybe after the election. But it's not just a win-win situation. There are some tough situations that have to be dealt with, especially on the employment front. I think that is the most crucial overriding challenge that we face, and that is why we need to take the National Development Plan seriously, whether in the public or the private sectors. I'm not pointing a finger at government, but government is a leader in this field. Government determines policy. And what we want from a business point of view is, of course, that there should be collaboration and consultation on implementation. I've said before, if we could factor talking into our growth rate, we would be the fastest growing economy in the world. So we really have to get on with things now. And today was a first step of a new look about doing decisive things in order to implement to be able to implement the National Development Plan.
Now, in an economy, obviously, you've got key players, and everyone has to play their role, so to speak. You've spoken about what government is doing. The economists that we spoke to earlier were talking about the private sector sort of sitting back on cash piles, not putting their money where their mouth is, partly because of policy uncertainty. What do you think it's going to take? I'll start with you, Asif. What do you think it's going to take for business to get off their cash piles and start injecting them into the South African economy?
I don't think it's somehow we give the impression that it's government to blame. That's why the private sector is sitting on the cash piles. I don't think that's the only reason. I certainly think business can come out there and they can invest. Government to a certain extent has to a large extent supported the private sector. If you look at 15 million social grants going out to beneficiaries out there, who are the end beneficiaries of this consumption? It's been business. The retailers have been booming because of that. It's time for them to come and invest, and they need to be proactive about it. They can't wait for government to do more and more. Government has been doing, I agree, and I say that the infrastructure implementation has been a bit slow, although the renewable projects in terms of energy has been phenomenally good, and it's been well executed, and it's been going, and that will create not a lot of job growth, but there will be job growth, but nevertheless it is investment. The point I also want to make is we've got to move to poverty reduction. And with poverty reduction and the whole question of unemployment, as Professor Parsons alluded to earlier on, is the question of skills development. The Minister has not mentioned a lot of that, but I know in the background that they have been doing a lot. You're looking at the National Students Financial Assistance Scheme. It's been a very good government scheme. People don't really promote it. People don't really talk about it. But what it's done is brought a lot of people that have been previously disadvantaged, who don't have the money and the resources to go to university and to technicons, and they've managed to give them funding to be able to do that. And if they passed in the first year, 40% gets converted to a bursary, and their final year, 100% gets converted to a bursary. So a lot of youth that were previously had no hope and could not go to university or to tertiary education or to technicons, they are now able to do that. So you're starting to see that coming through. You're starting to see youth coming through. Now the question is, now the Youth Employment Subsidy Scheme is coming in at the maybe a bit too late, but at the right time to be able to encourage people to go into the formal sector, encourage the private sector to employ people. Now it's for the private sector to say, we've got the subsidy scheme, let's do it, let's take it on, and let's employ people, especially young people. But at the same time, we don't want them to retrench older people so that they can reduce costs. They've really, in a very sincere way, try and employ the youth that's coming through
and
now.
That's
I
where
wonder
Labour has its concerns.
if I could build on that, because in one sense, and I think we're all a bit guilty of this, when we look at the budget speech, when we look at even the National Development Plan, we pick out the numbers that we think are essential for our future, whether it's investment, employment, poverty reduction, what we should be doing, what sort of targets we should have. For example, in terms of the National Development Plan, we want to create about 11 million jobs by 2030, which is an enormous challenge. I think what's missing in a lot of the debate, both today and in the National Development Plan, the one target that's missing, we should be saying we want to create 1 million new businesses over the next 10 or 15 years. What are we doing, other than talking about it indirectly, about the policy environment and encouraging SMMEs and so forth? The fact is, we should say one of our targets, that list of targets, is 1 million new enterprises over the next decade, because they are going to create the jobs, not government. I think my colleague is absolutely right. At the end of the day, both the NDP and the Minister today are saying, at the end of the day, the private sector has got to help us to deliver what we want. But we want a bigger private sector. We want a bigger private sector. We want a new private sector. And I think one of the most important targets that we should be setting ourselves over and above the existing macro targets is we want to create, say, 1 million new jobs over the next 10 years or so. And what do we specifically have to do in order to make that happen? Because entrepreneurship, ultimately, a broader base of entrepreneurship is essential, because by world standards, we are very low in entrepreneurship. We've got a lot of catching up to do. And what do we need to do in order to make sure that will flourish and then create the jobs that we want to see being created over the next few years?
Some rich ideas from both of you. Thank you so much, gentlemen. All right, that was a business representation. That was Professor Raymond Parsons from BUSA and Asif Mohammed from the Black Business Council. After the break, we have some more guests for you.
What time is it? It's question time.
Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, punishing them for their own future, because if they don't correct these things, it's going to be a time bomb down the line.
That's question time with me, Mpho Tsedu, Monday to Saturday, 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
Well, good evening. Welcome to yet another bumper edition of Sports Live. Tonight we have a bit of a triple threat in the show.
That's Sports Live, daily at 8:30 p.m. on SABC News, Channel 404.
time is it? It's question time.
I do not trust your criticism because, after all, you don't like the members of this committee. Why should we believe that you're going to like anything that they come up with?
We can't trust the Professor Njabule Ndebele, who was the Vice Chancellor of Cape Town. Bani Pichan was the Vice Chancellor of UNISA.
That's question time with me, Mpotsedu, Monday to Saturday, 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
Well, we've had the view of economists, we've had the view of business, and now time to take a view from Labour. I'm joined by Dennis George. He's General Secretary at FEDUSA. Thanks very much for joining me again, Dennis. What were your thoughts about the Minister's budget speech?
Look, I mean, we are concerned about the low growth projection of 2.1% for 2013 and going up to 3.5% in 2016, because that growth is too little and too low to be able to generate jobs, because jobs and inequality and poverty is our biggest challenges. And it is quite important then in terms of our undertakings that government and business need to come together and try to address the structural problems in our economy. We still have a lot of collusion in our economy. We have attempts by bigger businesses to keep small businesses out. You know, small businesses are starved from capital to get their business going and to get their business operation. And that is going to be a very important discussion if government is really serious about implementing the National Development Plan.
The Minister did talk about collaboration between Labour government and business. But what's the problem? Why can't you guys get together and be on the same page to strike the same goal?
Yeah, look, the issue of getting together is one thing. The other issue of implementing what we have agreed upon. I can give you one example where government, business and labour have agreed to work together on getting the labour relations process in this country going. But then at the same time we see announcements of CEOs' salaries. There's some of the CEOs that earn 16 million a year, some people earn 32 million a year, and then they want to tell the workers they must be happy with a wage increase of, let's say, inflation plus 1%, and then there's some companies are the culprits that is implementing casualization, you know, part-time work, and that is not something where how you create a more equal society. And that is the reason why, you know, we felt that it was important for government, you know, to really put time frames in place to say, look, before the end of the year, there's going to be an indaba between business and labour. We also saw that during the World Cup, where government invested huge amounts of money, where these companies actually came and colluded with one another and forced us to pay much higher prices. Now how do you deal with business people that have an attitude of greed, an attitude of looking after themselves only, instead of being committed towards the country? And on top of that, studies that showed that the markup in our manufacturing sector is twice as high as the markup is in America and with the rest of the world. You know, clearly we need to open up this economy, and we need to give people that didn't have opportunity to be part of the economy to participate. And that is something that need to be addressed urgently.
Now, in his speech, the Minister did talk about tabling the new employment tax initiative or incentive tomorrow in Parliament. You have raised some objections to it. Just go over your objections. I know, but in principle, you're for it.
Yes, look, what we have said to government, it's no use you just going to just incentivize companies to employ young people. What you need to do with that is to create opportunities where the people will receive skills training and also skills development. Because we know once a person has gone through a learnership, for instance, or through an apprenticeship, for them to enter into permanent and full-time jobs is quite high. It's almost 79%. So we want the government to build a link, and the Minister did announce today that they are going to put the skills development part of the process. But again, you know, the behavior of business, you know, in the past, you know, doesn't give us confidence that they are going to do the right thing.
Now, the Minister highlighted some of the initiatives from government side in terms of policy that they're pushing forward to actually realise the NDP. Do you think that there's some areas where they could improve and perhaps get our growth rate higher than it is right now?
No, of course, I think what is important in the cornerstone for the NDP is education, because education is the key to the future, and especially when it comes to young people. But what we've done in the past was we've neglected the teachers, the lecturers in our society, and we saw that their salaries have not kept rate with what's happening in the private sector, whether it's people, maths teachers or science teachers or accounting teachers, and those people are actually the good ones are leaving the education system, and then we find other people have to fill up the gap. And I think that is the first cornerstone that we want to say to government. Let us look together and restore the dignity and the professionalism in education. On the other side, some of our members are also very naughty, because they tend to disrupt the education system at the flip of a dime. And we feel that there must be procedures where both parties try to solve problems instead of creating problems.
But how do we resolve that situation? Because it is really key. If our educators don't want to show that they're able, in terms of professional papers and so on and so forth, to educate our young, and they don't want to cooperate with government in terms of boosting educational attainment, I mean, surely something needs to be done there. Otherwise, we're always continue going to have these conversations.
The only way that you can address any problem, and that is through dialogue. Where the parties can sit down together and they have to listen to one another. And you must also accept that, it's for some teachers teaching for 35 children in a class, those ratios is quite high. And it's very stressful on teachers. And I think it's important that we need to focus to provide support for them and to show more understanding for their concerns when they raise it, in terms of the delivery of books. I mean, how can you teach for a full year if the books only arrive in June month? And that put more pressure on the system, and therefore we must become more professional. We must also show more respect to teachers and listen to their concerns. And I think, once we can strike that accord amongst teachers and amongst the officials of the education department, then we can see better results. But it's also important that parents have to play their role in education, because, a teacher can teach a child in school to read, but it's also the responsibility of the parent in evenings and on weekends to sit down with their own children and read with them and read for them, because reading is very important for comprehension.
Absolutely. Now, we know that we have responsibilities as a society, but there are external factors which impact us. So, for example, foreign investors look at how we conduct ourselves in South Africa. Labour has not done much good this year and last year for the name of South Africa in terms of the violence and the regularity of strikes. I know that FEDUSA has not really been involved in many strikes in recent times, but what do you think it's going to take for Labour to be able to deal with its grievances in a less confrontational and less violent manner?
Look, we have made proposals to government to say, look, this issue of having thumb-suck negotiations, where workers would just thumb-suck, how much do they want to demand? I think it must be research-based, that before the negotiation starts, the research reports on the financial viability and the profitability of companies must be presented to workers, but companies also have to look at the socio-economic realities of workers. Some of the workers that lives in Kailicha or in Mitchell's Plain, they have to get up like 6 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning, only to be at work at 8 o'clock. On the other side, what you must also remember, the issue of unsecured lending has played a major problem in the mines, where people are getting garnishing orders against workers, and at the end of the day, the employers have to deduct these garnishing order deductions. And that's the reason why Trevor Manuel said, the garnishing orders and this unsecured lending has resulted in many workers being over in debt, and the employers sometimes don't even have control when they have to deduct these monies from the worker's salary, and therefore the workers go home with sometimes, a very small amount. And we have to look at that. And if you look at African Bank, they have decided to pay a fine to the government of to the National Credit Regulator of 20 million, and they wanted to fine them 300 million, because you can't go around in a society where you just want to extract from the workers, because those kinds of things have resulted in Marikani, where people started to demand 100% salary increases because they go home with nothing.
Now you say that, does that mean that you support the recommendation or proposal of an amnesty for people who've got indebted?
Look, I think, the banks have a responsibility to, before you make loans available to people, to ensure that the people are going to be able to repay those loans. You see, so in terms of the amnesty, I think we would really like to engage with government about that, and that we must also have consumer education for workers, because that's very critical, to explain to people a loan comes with interest, and because those loans, interest is much higher than you will get for interest on other stuff. And then also the issue of credit card abuse is something that we must be very careful of.
All right, thanks very much, Dennis, for your comments and your insights. Let's hope that the future of Labour government and private enterprise will come together, and we can make this economy the great economy it should be. All right, we have another break, and then afterwards we have a prized interview coming up with the Finance Minister himself.
Hello, Pastor.
Those years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay, he admitted it.
I was 7, walking from a distance from Davidton. I'm walking all the way to Witbank. And in my young mind, I believe it's a walking distance.
We had a smooth transition from 1988 up to 1994.
Not everyone had a TV.
We didn't have criminal records. We didn't have, the things that Cape Town arrivals normally had.
Why opera?
There was a gap. I took it, and it worked out.
That's Up Close, Monday to Thursday, 2:30 p.m. on SABC News.
What time is it? It's question time.
Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, punishing them for their own future, because if they don't correct these things, it's going to be a time bomb down the line.
That's question time with me, Mpotsedu, Monday to Saturday, 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
Welcome back to this special broadcast on the midterm budget. I'm joined by none other than the Finance Minister himself, Pravin Gordhan. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, you seem to have assaulted the government spending in terms of cutting down what executives can do. That was a very good move on your part, a good gesture.
Well, it's a gesture on government's part as a whole, and what's important is that it's a decision made with the President and the whole of Cabinet, and essentially saying we've done various things over the last 4 years in the context of a very, very difficult recession where we lost 60 billion rands in revenue, we lost 1 million jobs, and we haven't quite recovered, although we're still at about 2% growth. And we need to do more to demonstrate that we are also willing to, as Cabinet and as officials, make some sacrifices. And here's a set of decisions. Some of them come from the Interministerial Committee that Minister Sisulu chairs, and others have been developed through various processes. And the aim here is to show to the public that there are responsible people in government, that we are willing, as I said, to make sacrifices and try to set an example for the next generation of political office bearers that are going to come through as well.
Now, interestingly, and it was expected that you would revise the growth forecast down. You revised it down to 2.1%. But on the other hand, you seem to be able to meet the budget target deficit for this year that you expected in February. How so?
Well, we have reduced on the revenue side by 3 billion rands in anticipation of the lower growth. But on the other hand, the revenue collection is reasonably good at the moment. So if everybody watching us says, I will pay my taxes and I'll pay my fair share, then by the 31st of March next year, we should be in a position to say either that we've stuck to our deficit target or we've in fact come lower because we've collected more taxes. So that's the good side of what's going on. Although we're still borrowing money, and it's important that in the medium term, we ultimately start borrowing less. We decrease the amount of money we owe to the world. We decrease the amount of interest that we're paying on the borrowing. This year alone will be 100 billion rands in interest. And over the next 3 years, we're saying bring all of those amounts down so that we can find more money within the system to pay for the various things that government has to pay for.
Now, you can do what you can do, and South Africans can do what they can do. But then, of course, like you said, we're not insulated. We're affected and impacted by the external world. If, say, for example, the U.S. Federal Reserve does start tapering its quantitative easing, and then emerging markets like South Africa are impacted, you said it would increase our debt costs and so on and so forth. Wouldn't that then derail some of your plans going forward as well?
Well, that sort of turbulence normally is temporary turbulence, and it's although some of its effect could be felt over a long term, and much of that particularly applies to foreign borrowings. And what we have been able to do over the last 19 years as an ANC government is to control the amount of money we borrow in dollars or in euros. So that means that if the exchange rate shifts, it doesn't have too big an impact upon us. But that is why we said to South Africans, this is a tough time. It's tough because we have to grow more, we have to create more jobs, and as government, labor and business, we need to work together and harder in order to create the right kind of investment climate so businesses come and invest in South Africa and create jobs in South Africa. But we have no control over what happens in the world. So as you correctly pointed out, it could either be the quantitative easing problem from the United States, it could be the problem that we just experienced, a week ago, where the United States couldn't raise its debt ceiling until almost midnight on the last day. It could be a crisis that might come from a European bank, for example, because everybody says that they are still not as stable as they should be. But the key, we can get hit by a flu, you can get hit by a chest infection, but it's the strength of your body that ultimately enables you to resist, because not everybody dies from a flu, right? So we must build the ability to bounce back. We must build up the ability to get back to higher levels of growth and higher levels of job creation. And I think that's the test. It's not a test for government only. 70% of our economy is in the hands of the private sector. So we believe that we can and work with the private sector and with the organized labor to create the right conditions for the economy to grow. And that's the test for all of us in South Africa.
Well, these are testing times. I mean, tomorrow you're going to be tabling the employment tax incentive, and already you have Labour in the wings sort of protesting against it. Can you just briefly tell the nation what you propose to do, what that incentive is all about, and how you assuage Labour to come on board to understand the meaning of it?
You see, when we had the so-called Lehman moment, that is the Lehman Brothers, the American bank that went under, and as a result of which we had this financial crisis, which is what we call today the Great Recession, that came to South Africa in early 2009. One of the challenges that the whole world faced was, how do you keep firms alive? How do you make sure they don't go out of business? What can governments do to support firms? What can governments do to ensure that workers remain at work? And so around the world, different techniques were used. So in Germany, people stayed in their job, but they only worked 4 hours a day. In other places, you might have worked 3 weeks in a month, not the 4th week in a month, but you still had your job. In yet other places, support was given to younger people in the form of saying to an employer, if this worker costs you X thousand rands, we from government will pay the first 1,000 towards you employing. So we decrease your employment costs and we decrease the costs in your business. So these are lessons that we've learned from around the world. They're not South African by any means. And so in the South African case, where you have so many people generally unemployed, and more specifically amongst our youth, This bill is actually saying let's do two things. One is Minister Davies is currently setting up special economic zones in which industries can set up their businesses, and in order to encourage them to take on as many workers as possible, let's give them an incentive which will say, let's share costs. You pay X, we pay Y, but we reduce your costs in that way. Similarly, across the country, we are saying for young people to get their first job, because around the world, the lesson is if young people can get into their first job, their career prospects change completely, and they become very positive. So how do we share costs? So what we want are businesses in South Africa, small and medium and big, which are willing to come forward and saying, I'm going to take people with a matric, I'm going to take people with their first degree off our streets, give them their first work opportunity so they can say, I worked for 1 year, I worked for 2 years, this is the experience I've got, this is the training I've received, and they can move on to their next job. What we are doing as government is providing a subsidy or an incentive for businesses to actually do that. So if you're going to pay a young person 5,000 rands a month, then you will get, say, up to 4,000 rands a month, you're going to get 1,000 rands paid by government itself.
So what safeguards will you have in place to ensure that employers don't pull a fast one and get rid of their old workers?
So that's the part where we've listened very carefully to the unions, and their concerns are very valid because some employers might well engage in that exercise. And what we are saying is that there will be a sort of penalty in the legislation which we introduce tomorrow, which will say you're going to pay a fine of X or Y, depending on what kind of transgression you've been guilty of. The CCMA will get involved to see whether you've actually complied with the rules. And in that way, we want to ensure that no existing worker will be displaced as a result of this legislation coming into place. This is about creating more employment for the unemployed.
In terms of this measure, to what extent do you hope it will broaden the tax base?
Well, these are people who are going to earn very low incomes in some instances, excuse me, and in other instances they might advance to higher levels of work and therefore higher levels of income. And I suppose once people are in the system, they are employed, then the SARS register, which currently says that there are about 13 million employed people in South Africa, will grow to 14 million and 15 million. Currently there's about 6 and 7 million that are paying tax. That will begin to increase as well. So this is the beginning of a long process which over the next 5 or 10 years will pay very important dividends. More taxes will come from a broader base of people, and government will then have more money available to build new roads or new dams or build new housing and support businesses with other kinds of incentives. What we forget is that currently there are lots of incentives in our tax system. So if you look at the automobile industry in South Africa, there's a special program which actually assists them but costs us about 10 to 12 billion rands a year. Similarly, the textile industry is supported by government in a particular way through an incentive as well. So already businesses and therefore workers are actually benefiting from different types of tax arrangements that we have in legislation. This just takes that one step further.
Okay, thanks very much, Minister Gordhan. Thank you so much for your time. Well, that was Minister Gordhan. He was giving us a little bit of detail on what he had to say on the midterm budget. He sounds confident about our future, but the key message is that everybody has to come together to make South Africa a greater and bigger economy. Well, that was your special broadcast from the SABC on the midterm budget. Thanks for joining us, and take care.